again, my name is Maggie Dudeck. I'm acting lead for the NHSN Methods and Analytics team. And today I will be talking to you about our plans for updating the National Risk Adjustment of HAI data at CDC, something that we have affectionately referred to as the Rebaseline. So for this morning, I will be reviewing with you kind of our timeline for updating that risk adjustment at the national level. I'll also touch on the importance of data quality. I know you've heard from my colleagues about the importance of data quality, but I'm just going to hit it one more time. And also, we'll discuss some of the potential impact of using those updated risk models. So before we talk about where we're going and moving forward, I would like to take a few moments to talk about where we've been and where we are currently. This is a review. You guys have had a couple of days or a few days learning about the SIR already, but just to hit it one more time, we know that the SIR, or Standardized Infection Ratio, is a summary statistic, and it allows us to compare the number of HAIs or events that were reported to NHSN to the number that were predicted to occur. And that predicted number is based on a calculation using data for those HAI events that occurred in a given referent time period. And that referent time period is what we've referred to as the baseline. So in simplest terms, the SIR is number of observed divided by number of predicted. It is a straight up ratio. The national SIR baseline is essentially the HAI incidence rate for that given referent time period, and that's what we use to calculate predicted number for a subsequent time period. Now, with regard to the baseline, it's not like there's necessarily a set standard or practice on how long a baseline time period should be used, when it should be updated, why it should be updated. The decision to update a baseline time period and risk adjustment could be the result of multiple factors. For example, given policies or definitions, surveillance protocols, things like that. This is a really quick view of our current national SIR baselines that we use, and these are the baselines that we implement not only for your hospitals within the NHSN application, but these are the exact same baselines and data we use when we calculate our own national SIRs that we publish each year and state-based SIRs. So you can see when we see this all in one table. Now I know you've received all of this information already from my colleagues, but when we see it in one table, you can see that the baseline referent period will differ depending on the HAI type or sometimes the setting, the healthcare setting. And the predicted number is also calculated using various methods. So for example, for CLABSI, acute care hospitals still have the baseline of January 2006 to 2008. But for long-term acute care hospitals, or LTACs, we actually use data from 2013. When we look at the calculation for predicting the HAIs, CLABSI and CAUTI are calculated using rate data, meaning that we actually take stratified pooled mean rates from that baseline time period. Those rates are stratified by CDC location. And we use that information to calculate the predicted number at the unit level first, and then we roll it up to the to a facility level or a more summarized measure. SSI and LabID data, as you know, are calculated using a risk model. SSI uses logistic regression, and the LabID uses negative binomial regression. So, as you've probably heard, we do have plans to calculate new SIR baselines at the national level for each of the HAI types. There are a few key considerations that we have when we embark on this project. And one is, there is a need for a single referent period and consistent methods to the extent possible when we calculate the predicted number of infections. I'm sure you can imagine how difficult it is to explain, even within your own hospital, well, this SIR is calculated using data from 2008, but this one is calculated from data using 2011, and it's just a little inconsistent. And, you know, we battle with that at the national level as well. So we do look forward to having this single time period for our baselines. There were major changes to HAI definitions and criteria in 2015 and even in years prior. I'll spend a few minutes talking about that, but of course, most notably in 2015 was the change to the CAUTI definition. The 2015 HAI data and our risk modeling strategy do present an opportunity to update the national SIR baselines in a uniform way. And it also allows us an opportunity and some time to think about extending scope of prevention activities by including more facilities for the calculation of the SIR. We'll also talk about that today. So our magic word is rebaseline. And we will be hearing this over and over and over and over again today. You know, I hope that, you know, by the end of this, we'll feel a little bit more comfortable and informed with Rebaseline as a project that we have. I wanted to provide you all with kind of the scope of our Rebaseline project as a whole. This is not all-inclusive. This is just kind of a shortened outline list of what we are working on at CDC. So, of course, we will be updating the risk models for the SIRs and HAI types that we currently calculate SIRs for, right? So CLABSI for acute care hospital, we're going to be updating those risk models. We will investigate new risk adjustment methods for CLABSI, CAUTI, and even VAE data. Currently, what we have available are the new national pooled mean rates for VAE, but we do not have any SIRs for VAE data, and so we'd like to be able to provide that as well. Also, introducing SIRs for lab ID for LTACs and IRFs. Again, LTACs and IRFs right now just have the overall rates available for their facility, fact-wide in rates. And that's because when we performed the risk adjustment initially for CDI and MRSA, there were very few LTACs and IRFs that had been reporting during that time period. And those that were reporting, their rates were much different than what we saw in acute care. So we had decided to exclude them from that original analysis. With the onset of reporting of lab ID from those settings in 2015 for CMS, we now have like a full pool of data that we can use to determine the appropriate risk adjustment for those settings. There's also the potential for lowering what we call the minimum precision criterion that actually determines when we calculate the SIR. And this lowering the minimum precision criterion is actually a bit separate from the rebaseline as a whole, but it is something that falls along well with our timing. Minimum precision criterion, what I mean by that is, as you all know, SIRs are not calculated when the number predicted is less than 1. And so we are looking at the potential for lowering that threshold. We'll also need to assess the potential impact of this new baseline on HAI trends and how our partners can trend over time. And then the big one, of course, is implementing these into the NHSN application so that everybody can actually use these data at their own hospital. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on the next 4 slides. These are just a summarized review of what you've already learned this week about the risk adjustment and calculations for the number of predicted infections. So many of you may know that we do actually calculate pooled mean rates and device utilization ratios at the national level every single year, but those updated rates for CLABSI and CAUTI are not used in the SIR calculations. We keep that baseline static. So, you know, we have the baseline time periods mentioned here, and I have the references on the slide. As a review, we calculate the number of predicted at the unit level first by taking the baseline pooled mean divided by 1,000, and we multiply that by the central line days or device days for that unit. CAUTI is very similar. The only differences with CAUTI is, of course, we use a different device day count because it's a different device-associated infection. And the baseline for acute care hospitals is different. We actually use data from 2009. And that's because in 2009, we implemented a new CAUTI definition that then had been previously used in NHSN prior to that time. Surgical site infection data, again, a review for you. Back in the old days or early days of NHSN and even in NIS, we did calculate stratified pooled mean SSI rates. Rebecca talked about this a little bit. They were stratified by a 3-factor basic risk index, as we called it. Well, the last time we published SSI rates was in 2009, and that included data from 06 to 08. We used those same kind of data reported during that time period to come up with new actual risk models for SSI data. There were 3 models developed during that time. As you know, the all SSI model is the most inclusive. The complex AR model is essentially a subset of procedures and SSIs, and it is more suitable for public reporting than the all SSI model. It is the model that we use to publish data at CDC for the various procedure categories at the national level. And the complex 30-day model is used for the CMS quality reporting programs. It's limited to colo and hysterectomy procedures, and it is an NQF endorsed measure that is used for those programs. And finally, a review of LabID. LabID is fresh on everyone's minds this morning. We actually had never previously produced any sort of risk stratified rates for LabID. So when we produced the SIRs, that was the first actual risk-adjusted national metric that we had for LabID. It is limited to MRSA, bacteremia, and CDI, as we know. And it actually predicts the number of healthcare facility onset incident events. It does not predict any other type of onset events for those organisms. The baselines spanned over 2 years' time. It is only available for acute care hospitals, as I mentioned, FACT-wide in data only. We don't have any risk models for location-specific LabID reporting. So now I'm going to take a few minutes, and for those who have been using NHSN or have been performing surveillance in their hospitals for a few years, we're kind of going to go back in time and see how much has really changed with NHSN since our original baseline time periods. So of course we've had a large increase in the number of facilities. Dan Pollock showed that on the first day, how much we've grown over the past 10 years. That growth started out as a result of state mandates, and then of course was followed up by CMS quality reporting programs. The demographics of facilities that report to NHSN today are much different than what they were previously. When we focus in on healthcare-associated infections, we know that we now have all of the LTACs and inpatient rehab facilities, or IRFs, reporting to NHSN. We have a much larger number of critical access hospitals reporting. We have a large number of non-teaching hospitals, much larger than we had during the original baseline time period, particularly for CLABSI. We've also had an increase in the number and types of units that report device-associated infection data. So one of the questions we get a lot is about telemetry wards and mixed acuity units. We know that a lot of you have been reporting for these data, and you say, they're not included in my SIRs, they're not included in my TAP reports, how can I get them included? The reason that these are excluded is because they just weren't available as location types for reporting data during those original baselines in 2008, 2009. Those were added after the fact. And so we just don't have those baseline data for them from that original time period. We also have defined more oncology ICUs and ward types, and we know that many hospitals are reporting for those, and some specialty or non-general ICUs and wards, so something outside of the general medical, surgical, or med-surg wards. When we look at procedure level data, we know we have many more procedures that are reported each year to us, including more outpatient procedures than what had been reported in 2006 to 2008. We have introduced, and there's been an increased use of clinical document architecture, or CDA, and so that does allow facilities to potentially report more data than what they would have been able to previously, kind of reducing the burden on them for collection and reporting, particularly with SSIs and procedures. And we have a much larger number of partners that use the NHSN group function. So many of you are probably a member of at least one group, whether that be your state health department, a QuinnQIO, maybe your hospital is part of a corporate system, and your corporate level folks are interested in being able to analyze your NHSN data. So not only does that put extra eyes on the data for accuracy, but it also puts extra eyes on the data to work towards various prevention efforts and initiatives. I'm not going to read all of these because I know you probably know them if you've been using NHSN, but this is just to highlight that since the original baselines, we've had a number of changes, additions, removals to the HAI definitions. We used to have a UTI ASB specific event. Does anybody here remember that? That's what we discontinued in 2009. We used to have BSI CSEP, or clinical sepsis. Anybody in the house remember that? Couple people. So we've definitely come a long way since then. And we also used to collect catheter days, umbilical catheter days, separate from non-umbilical in the NICUs. In addition to those specific HAI, actual specific site definitions, we've also had other refinement and definition changes in the NHSN protocols. 14-day repeat infection timeframe that you've all learned about today, defining present on admission, defining what the date of event is. All of that factors into these sorts of changes in the data. Of course, last year we required the reporting of lab ID events from ED and observation units when following FACT-wide-in surveillance. And then for procedures, we now collect more risk factor information. So we get the height and weight in order to calculate body mass index. We calculate whether or not the patient, we collect whether or not the patient has diabetes, and if their SSI was present at time of surgery. So now that we've kind of taken a quick look back in time, let's kind of move forward and talk about the analytic plans at CDC and how some of that may impact all of you. So what's been mentioned before here today, as well as through other communications, the data that are reported to NHSN for the calendar year 2015 are going to be used as the new baseline for our future SIRs. We do plan to use a complete year of data for our final risk adjustment and risk models. It's important to us that we have as much data as possible to calculate those models. The methods and models may vary from original baselines, and I actually kind of want to say they will vary, particularly with CLABSI and CAUTI, and we'll talk about that in a second. What I also want to point out here is that this is not just a simple, okay, let's just take the 2015 data and dump it into the previous models that we have, and that'll all be fine. We're actually reassessing everything. This analysis, we're just starting fresh, right? We have new data. We have, you know, for all the reasons I described earlier, this is a brand new set of analyses that will be performed. So it's not like we can just replace new data into the old models. So all of the applicable factors will be assessed or reassessed during this analytic project. And that includes the use of the quarterly prevalence rates and the quarterly CDI test type for lab ID. We are, you know, going to take a careful look at that and see if that's something that is significant and if it's going to work the way it has worked in the past. Right now, we just don't know because we haven't run those final models. So I wanted to provide you with a quick timeline. I say quick, feels quick, maybe doesn't feel quick to you all because you've been working so hard to get these data reported. So beginning last spring and through May of this year, we've been doing a lot of preliminary analyses at CDC. We've been looking at the surveys that were reported last year. Even though they won't be used in this risk adjustment, we wanted to look at the new information that was collected and kind of run through any data quality checks, improve on anything that we needed to improve on. Looking at events, denominator data, you know, are there any things that we need to be concerned with? Are there any sort of things that we need to fix, any outreach that we need to do? And our preliminary analyses will include the production of what we're calling preliminary risk models using 3 quarters worth of data. What I think is important to kind of point out here is that at CDC, we consider a quarter's data to be complete once that CMS quarterly reporting deadline has passed, because that's when we have the highest volume of data and we expect the data to be of the highest quality by that point. So that's 4.5 months after the end of a quarter. So we just passed the 3rd quarter deadline, meaning we just now have 3 quarters worth of data that we can start to run through and assess the data for some potential risk factors and run some preliminary models. On June 1st, so that'll be about a couple weeks after the 4th quarter CMS deadline, we will begin our final analyses and risk adjustment. So we're gonna take those risk models, add in that extra quarter's worth of data, and just reassess everything. How does it look? Are there any risk factors that have kind of fallen out of the models, anything that comes back in? And by July 15th, we expect to have the risk adjustment complete for all of our analyses. So we expect to have our final risk models done. That gives us 1 month to run through, validate, verify the models that we have, and be prepared to submit 2016 quarter 1 data to CMS using that new 2015 baseline, okay? So for anything that is CMS reportable, we will run through, make sure all the files are correct, the risk adjustment is correct. Now, here's the point that I'm kind of afraid to tell you all. We won't be able to implement these models into the actual reporting application until hopefully early December of 2016, okay? So that's when we'll be able to incorporate the new SIRs, risk adjustment, and also have, you know, plenty of educational materials and things like that available. Also, at this point in time on this slide, I just want to remind everybody, please complete your surveys as soon as possible if you have not already. That will help speed this process along from our end and give us a little bit more time for the final risk adjustment. It's incredibly important that we have those surveys in as soon as possible. I also want to spend a moment about data quality checks. Again, you've heard a lot about this already this week, but our preliminary analyses that began last spring have included some regular data quality checks, okay? It's been important for us to kind of check in on those things that were newly reported, newly defined, redefined. so that we can kind of get ahead of our risk adjustment analytic time period. So some of the things that we've looked at, now this is, again, not an all-inclusive list. This is just a short list of some of the things we've looked at. Looking at outlier detection for height, weight, and body mass index on the procedure records. Looking at the adoption of the sample denominator data collection method for CLABSI and CAUTI, and kind of taking a look at, how many hospitals are adopting this practice for their device-associated data. If they have adopted it, is it being used according to the protocol, or do we feel like there's maybe some inconsistencies or misunderstanding in the protocol for those data? Zulika spent a lot of time talking about the CDI test type, as did Denise, and that's something that we are constantly looking at, is the accurate reporting of a CDI test type every quarter. Also, if there's been reporting from ED and observation units as required for the FACWIDE protocol for MRSA and CDI, and checking in on the reporting of lab ID from LTACs and IRFs. The other thing I want to mention is, we have, during Rebecca's presentation, she talked about, procedure duration outliers, basically. If a procedure has a duration of less than 5 minutes or over a certain threshold. Zulika talked about outlier prevalence rates and how those quarters are excluded from SIR calculations. Outlier detection is part of the risk modeling process, and so that's something that we will continue to look at outliers in these risk models and determine how best to handle that. Some of you may be aware of this already, but when we notice something significant or something that we need maybe a little bit more understanding of or information on for our data quality issues, the team has done some outreach to the affected hospitals. And, when we look at these things and we see there's a CMS deadline coming up, we say, you know what, we really want to reach out to them now and ask them to fix it now so that hopefully their CMS data can be corrected in time. We also provide education during these trainings and via our quarterly newsletters. You saw that Zulika showed the new CDI test method history line list. So that's the result of running all these data quality checks and figuring out a way to provide hospitals and groups a way to review that data themselves as well. So this is a quick snapshot of the analyses that we have planned and prioritized. Each one of these check marks represents at least one analysis, okay? So there's a lot of analysis that needs to be performed. We also are considering looking at critical access hospitals separate from the rest of the acute care hospitals. We know that's a different population. There's a different magnitude of the volume of data coming in for certain HAIs, for all HAIs. We also plan to look at MBI LCBIs, VAE data, antimicrobial use, and resistance. And for SSI, we actually have multiple analyses that need to be performed. So not only will we look at the complex 30-day model that's NQF endorsed, we will also look at the other two models, the ALL and the complex AR, and those models are all separate for each procedure category, okay? So it's not like we have just one model for all procedures combined. Each individual procedure category has its own risk model and set of risk factors. In addition to each procedure category, we also have to look at age groups. So we are interested in having risk models for adult patients separate from pediatric patients for SSI data. For CLABSI and CAUTI, we are planning to move towards risk models like the other HAI types. And we would move away from looking at location stratified rates to calculate that predicted number. The reason for this is some prior analyses at CDC, I don't think they had been published, but they specifically looked at, is there really a significant difference in CLABSI rates or CAUTI rates when we look at the granular level CDC location types. And we know that things have changed so much since the original baseline. So the intent is to move towards more risk models. And so that would mean that we would not have location stratified rates at the national level. So hospitals could still get their own at their own individual location level, but at the national level, we would not anticipate having those available. But the good news is that it would allow us to assess for other sorts of factors. For example, this is just a short list: the type of facility. Is the facility bed size have anything to do with this? Medical school affiliation for more than just the 2 locations that, or 3 locations that's currently used for. So once the analysis is done, there's a lot that needs to be done with implementation that goes far beyond what we could put in a slide or probably even a slide deck. So as I mentioned, we will work to get these new risk models implemented into the actual application itself, hopefully in early December of this year. We would create basically, we would have new output options available to you on this new baseline so that none of the output and reports that you use today would be overrun with different baseline time periods. It'd kind of be like a new set available. And what we would actually do is calculate these for 2015 data and forward. So for those who were around when we initially implemented SIRs in NHSN, we would say, okay, well, CLABSI used the baseline 06 to 08, so we will only calculate SIRs for 09 and forward. Well, we're changing that now. So with the new baseline, with the rebaseline of 2015, hospitals will be able to get SIRs on that new baseline for their 2015 data and forward. For the original baseline output and reports, those will stay where they are, or I'm sorry, those will stay in the application, but we're going to maybe move them to another location on your output options screen. And I assure you we will have plenty of educational materials on that. And that's just kind of to keep them a little bit separate so you don't have a huge list, particularly with SSI. We want to make sure you don't have a list of 40-some output options or whatever would end up coming. And those will be calculated through 2016 data, okay? And we'll spend a minute talking about that. This is also a good opportunity for us to use the feedback that we've received from all of you in making improvements to our output options. So some of the things that we have planned is, for example, to have a rate table that's specific for MBI, LCBI data. Also adding an option that makes it very clear of how to run a cumulative rate or SIR. I think one of my colleagues showed that if you want a cumulative or a fiscal year SIR, you have to leave that group by option blank. That's not too intuitive, so we're looking to actually put something in that box so you know to choose that. Rebecca mentioned providing some what we call indicator variables, similar to what we have for Lab ID, that will indicate the procedures or SSIs that are excluded from the models with a brief explanation as to why they are excluded. Also, the last bullet I have on this slide is kind of a big one. So for those who may not know, currently any of our risk adjustment that brings in data from your hospital surveys will actually use the data on the most recent survey that your hospital has completed. And so we are going to change that. So for the new SIRs, what we plan to do is use the year of your survey to match along with the year of the data that you're analyzing, so that when this is all complete in December, all of your 2015 SIRs will be based on 2015 survey data. We figure that's the most appropriate way to risk adjust those data. All right, now I'm going to move on to something that we are considering. For those of you that have your slides, I encourage you to please make note that this is under consideration, and that is updating the minimum precision criterion, okay? So this is a potential for NHSN and something that we are currently working on. So again, right now, NHSN will not calculate SIRs if the predicted number is less than 1. The reason for that is to help protect the precision of that estimate. So if you have low precision SIRs with low predicted values, that could lead to extreme SIRs, and that may not be an accurate reflection of the performance in your hospital or group. So at the time that we first implemented SIRs, an arbitrary value of 1 was implemented, and that is for ease of the application, not the NHSN application, but the application of the SIRs themselves and applying those data and the interpretation of those data. This was something that was brand new for many of our hospitals. And it also allowed us to raise some awareness about precision of that estimate that had not previously been used for HAI rates. So what that means is if you have a unit that's reported 50 central line days for a quarter, we calculate a rate for you. And that may or may not be appropriate given the low volume, but it's something that is provided and can be used. And so we wanted to make sure that we can kind of put in some precision rules around the SIRs themselves, especially given the intended use of them by others other than the hospital. But of course, one of the downsides to this is that it excluded many facilities with positive HAI counts that reflect a need for prevention. Now, for some of you, you may not necessarily see that as a negative. You may see it as, we got a pass. But on the prevention side, it's incredibly important that those sorts of scenarios can be addressed and that they're not missed in the targeted prevention areas. So what's under consideration right now is the potential for updating the minimum precision criterion. We actually ran an analysis at CDC using July 2014 through June 2015 data. These are all data under the original baseline, so this analysis was not using some new risk models or anything like that. It was using the information we had available. And we looked at the SIR distribution of those facilities that had predicted values of less than 1. So what we did is we took all of those facilities with an SIR less than 1 for that 4-quarter or 1-year time period, and we calculated SIRs for them at increments of 0.1 for, and that 0.1 is the predicted level. So predicted of 0.1 to 0.2 to 0.3. And we looked at the variance above and below each threshold to determine if there's a significant difference in those values. So there is a negative side to this in lowering that minimum precision number, that threshold, and that is what it would actually do is add more facilities that have 0 infections. Okay, so when we're talking about a distribution of SIRs over a large group of facilities, we would now have a lot more that have 0 infections, which is good for prevention, but may be a downside if we were looking at targeting things based on a distribution. How many of you have heard of the adjusted ranking metric, or the ARM? Has anybody heard? I know my colleague Jonathan Edwards has spoken a few times at some conferences about the ARM, the adjusted ranking metric. I'm not going to go into it right now, but if we were to use that metric, which is basically a reliability adjusted SIR, it would basically account for this issue of facilities that have low precision, low volume, and the reliability of that estimate. But the bottom line is that when we ran through this analysis, when we looked at all HAI types for which we currently have the SIRs calculated, SIRs that were calculated below a predicted value of 0.2 had more variance than those above 0.2. So bottom line is there is the potential to calculate SIRs when the predicted number is at least 0.2. So that's quite different from a value of 1. There's a lot of data on this table. I'd like to thank Rishi for providing this. He actually ran this analysis. Again, this is using 1 year's worth of data on the original baselines, and this represents acute care hospitals. I do want to mention that when this analysis was run for LTACs and IRFs, there were very few, less than 10, that actually had a predicted number less than 1 over a 1-year time period. So we focused in on acute care hospitals. So what I'm going to do is let's just focus on CAUTI, and we'll kind of interpret the data in this table for you so you have an idea of the real impact of what could happen with SIRs if we were to lower that threshold. So when we look at CAUTI, there were over 4,000 facilities that reported CAUTI data during that time period. Now this is all CAUTI. This is not limited to ICUs or ICUs. It was anything that had been reported for CAUTI data for that time period. If we were to lower the threshold to 0.2, there would be 3,678 facilities that would have an SIR calculated for that time period. So 90% of facilities would have an SIR calculated for them. This is actually an increase of 812 facilities, or about 20%. So that's a considerable amount of facilities that would have SIRs calculated for them that previously would not have. Of those 812, 117 had reported 1 CAUTI, and another 23 had more than 1 CAUTI. So that's 140 facilities that had at least 1 infection out of that 812 that were added to the pool. Also, out of the about 3,600, 1,200 of them, or 33.6%, had an SIR of 0. And there was an increase that was seen as almost a 14% increase over what had previously been reported when we use a threshold of 1. All right, so I have a few minutes. I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions. I'm sure you have them. I want to talk about some of the questions that we have answers for, and then list some of the questions that we quite honestly don't have answers for yet, but we will work to get them answered. Big question. Will the MBI LCBIs be excluded from the CLABSI baseline? I know there's been maybe some misunderstandings or some, maybe some miscommunications on this at some point, but basically, right now, as of today, when you're analyzing your data, all of the MBIs are included in your SIRs and in your CLABSI rates. When we take the 2015 data, we will automatically take out the MBIs that had been reported, and the CLABSI SIRs and rates on that new baseline will be only those non-MBI CLABSIs, okay? The MBIs will be analyzed separately. So you would, when we implement those new data in December, you will see these removed from your CLABSI SIRs that use that baseline. Another question that we get a lot, quite a lot, is will the SSIs reported as present at time of surgery or PATOS be excluded from the SSI SIRs? And so today, what we can say is that the complex 30-day SSI SIRs that are reported for CMS, our plans are to exclude those that are reported as PATOS, but we will assess this variable for the other models separately. Those are all separate analyses. Another question is, once these become available in NHSN, will users have the ability to analyze their data under the previous baseline? In short, yes, you will. So I've included a graphic here. Basically, the original baseline data will be applied to SIRs for 2016 data and previous, and the new baseline will be applied for 2015 data and forward. So there's essentially 2 years of data with overlap where you could choose to look at the original baseline or start with the new baseline. And that should hopefully help with any sort of trend analyses that are going on in hospitals or through various partners and groups. And again, we will have new reports that will be created for this. Another question we get is, will this change increase or decrease the hospital's SIR? I think what's important to make note of is that the SIRs that are coming under the rebaseline, they're not really comparable to the previous SIRs under the original baseline. It's new data, it's new risk adjustment methods, it's new years. So think of the 2015 data as a new starting point, a new reference point to measure future progress. So with that being said, we expect that hospital SIRs will shift closer to 1. So if you have SIRs that are currently less than 1, we expect that they will shift a little bit up and closer to 1 under that new baseline, particularly for the first year or two that those SIRs are calculated. Another question we have is, hospitals transitioned to ICD-10 beginning in the fourth quarter of 2015. So what impact does this have on the SSI denominators and the SIRs, particularly for this new risk adjustment? Because we have 3 quarters where ICD-9 was being used and 1 quarter with ICD-10. So the direct impact is unknown at this time. We do have some additional validation being done of the procedure codes, and so hopefully that will lead us to have some more information on that. What about community onset prevalence rates from ED and observation units? So right now, these prevalence rates themselves are not used in the calculation for your SIRs. We will assess these community onset prevalence rates in the rebaseline. It's too early for us to know for sure if these will be a factor, but I think it's important to note that even today, those events reported from the ED and OBS do help to better categorize and more accurately categorize any subsequent events reported by your hospital. So you may notice that the potential for fewer healthcare onset events because those events may have been captured in the ED. This one, while I don't want to get too far into CMS's rules and requirements, I do want to let folks know, there's been some questions about the value-based purchasing program. What's the impact going to be on that? I've included a snapshot from the final rule that was published in the Federal Register on August 17th of last year. And so this will basically outline the use of the NHSN baseline, what they call the standard population data, and the use of those data in the new program years. In short, fiscal year 17 and 18 program years will use the current or original NHSN baseline, and 19 and 20 will use the new baseline. So again, there's 2 years where there's kind of overlap, where SIRs will be calculated on original and new baseline for 15 and 16 data. All right, another question, how can hospitals confirm their 15 and 16 CMS-related data prior to new SIRs becoming available? We encourage you to continue to use the CMS-related reports in NHSN. Those will be important for the current quality reporting program and value-based purchasing, since those data will still be used. But while these new SIRs are not going to be available until the end of this year, there's still plenty of relevant data available in NHSN that you can use. You can look at the number of events. You can review the patient days, the survey level data, categorization of lab ID events. Those sorts of things, are not going to shift. But I want to provide an example here focusing on MBI data. So what I have is an example of 2015 quarter 3 data. It's a CLABSI report for the CMS reporting. It shows I have 8 infections. My SIR is 4.2, so it's quite a bit high. And so when we calculate the new SIRs, the MBIs will be excluded. So how can we tell from this table how many CLABSIs would be excluded from the numerator? So the central line days won't change, but my infection count will change. How do I know what that infection count will be? So what I recommend is running the CLABSI frequency table. We have a variable called MBI_LCBI. If that value is yes, that means the CLABSI was reported as MBI, and if it's no, it means it wasn't. So in this example, I actually included an additional locations that are actually included in the CMS reporting, but what I can see is I have one MBI, or one CLABSI that was reported as an MBI. So I would know that event would be excluded from my CMS reporting and from my CLABSI reports under the new baseline. I think when you run a frequency table, this is event level data. You can get event level data regardless if you've reported your summary data. So you do have to have an understanding of, have you completed all of your summary data to know that your event data are complete and accurate as well, and align with your CMS report. We do have a quick reference guide available on this topic of how to look at your MBI data currently in NHSN. I've included a link at the bottom to our main quick reference guide page, so I do encourage you all to take a look at that when you get a chance. We have plenty of unanswered questions right now that we're going to work to answer them. I'm not going to read all these verbatim, but we do understand that many folks have questions about the impact of hospital rankings. How can a hospital or state trend their data over time? What's the best way to do that? What's going to be the impact on TAP reports and prevention activities? So we will, of course, do our best to work through that. I'm going to spend a couple of quick minutes talking about CAUTI. We actually had an article in the December 2015 newsletter about the CAUTI definition change in 2015. A lot of people have questions about how to trend their data over time because we haven't moved to a new baseline, yet there's a significant definition change. The 2015 definition excludes urine cultures positive only for yeast and non-bacterial pathogens and urine cultures with colony counts less than 100,000. Some facilities may notice a decrease in the number of CAUTIs they've identified in 2015 and forward due to this definition change. And you would see this in your SIRs as well as your rates. And that's because the predicted number is calculated using events reported under the previous definition. So my colleagues ran some data, and we found that the preliminary estimate of a national CAUTI SIR for 2 quarters worth of data was 0.55. So that is quite a change. In 2014, our SIR was 1. So that's a 45% decrease. That's pretty significant. What I do want to make note of, though, is that there's variability among hospitals in the proportion of CAUTI that are identified with yeast. So some hospitals may notice a less significant decrease than what we're seeing nationally. So just keep that in mind. So if you're looking at impact of prevention efforts on CAUTI, we do have some guidance, and I think we could probably include the link in the next newsletter. I don't know if it was available at the time of the December newsletter. But basically, we have instructions on how you can actually estimate the CAUTI events under the new definition using your older data. So if you wanted to look at 2014 compared to 2015 in your hospital and run a comparison of your rates to each other, then we have some instructions on how to export the data and figure out which CAUTIs would have been excluded under the new definition. And Rashad mentioned this, so I'm not going to spend a bunch of time on this, but in December of 15, we did recommend lowering that the CAD multiplier or the SIR goal, since so many hospitals would already be below the 0.75 action plan goal. So we do recommend lowering that to the national estimate. Take-home points. So we know 2015, that is our year. It's our rebaseline year. We will use those data. Updated risk adjustment will be applied across the HAI types. We'll begin submitting data to CMS with August 2016. hospitals and groups will have access to these SIRs in December. And then, of course, under consideration at CDC is to calculate SIRs when the predicted number is at least 0.2, and that can hopefully help expand the scope of prevention efforts. So, that is all I have. I am happy to take what questions you have, but please be kind, please.
Maggie, can you hear me okay?
No, I don't think that mic is on. Okay.
Okay, better?
Yes.
Okay, we've waited all week, so I will be kind. Quick question, because my name is Jamie Moran. I'm with the Quinn QIO in Washington and Idaho. And the new model for device-associated infections, will you be taking into account device utilization?
Okay, that is a great question. We are considering actually new measures to help complement the SIR. We have some colleagues who are looking into something called the Standardized Device Utilization Ratio, or SDUR. But device utilization itself, that has yet to be seen if we would use that in that risk modeling. But thank you for your comment and your feedback on that.
And one other quick question. As you said that the rates would no longer be available at the national level, would that include device utilization?
Actually, that's a really good question. I don't know the answer to that. I'm going to add that to my list of unanswered questions. I mean, I think that's something that we could certainly consider providing in one form or another. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Sarah from the Virginia Department of Health. I appreciated you mentioning critical access hospitals. As we're working on our statewide report, we're considering how to use the data that we get from critical access hospitals. We have about 80 acute care hospitals and 7 critical access hospitals, only 3 of which report data in NHSN to us. And I was just wondering, like, in the past, has CDC kind of lumped all that data in with their acute care hospitals? That's kind of what we've been doing, and that's kind of what other agencies in our state do, because we have so few of them, but it's definitely different data.
Absolutely. We had done that previously, and currently a critical access hospital would get an SIR that uses the exact same pooled means as an acute care. But a few years ago, we did look at their CLABSI and CAUTI data specifically and found that they did not necessarily need the granular level stratification that acute care hospitals needed by location type. So we're going to kind of look at those with fresh eyes this time around. Okay. Yep, thank you.
Hi, Lynn Wagner from the NCC QIO. Can you tell me how long after you do the new models for the SIR will you publish white papers on how it all works?
That is great. We don't have a strict timeline at this point, but realistically, it would probably be the first half of 2017. We have a large group of analysts that are, working through these data, so it's not just 1 or 2 people, and there's a lot of things for us to consider and reflect on when we produce those papers. So, yeah, thank you for that question. Are there any other questions? Yes.
Hi, Christine from Montana.
Hi.
I was curious, whenever you include these new facilities that have had below 1 predicted events, what are did it actually adjust and cure the high SIR problem, your method? What were some of those facilities that had less than 1 reported and had 2 or more events? What kind of SIRs are you ending up with?
So that is an excellent question. I think, and I don't know if Rishi's back there, but maybe you can talk with Rishi. I don't remember the numbers offhand. I don't think we had many that were extreme, extreme being like greater than 10. I think we did have some that were probably an SIR of 2 or 3, but I think if you can grab Rishi, he can kind of summarize that for you.
Okay.
Yep. Any other questions? Okay.